Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 22, National Differences of Wages, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, this is the fourth and final chapter in part 6 of 8 of Kapital Volume 1, Wages. And in this relatively brief chapter, Marx is going to get into some important topics pertaining to how the value of labor power is to be understood due to the different circumstances in different countries. In other words, wages may be higher or lower in one country versus another, but it doesn't necessarily indicate directly that the workers in one country are more or less exploited or more or less productive, because you have to consider the standard of living in those countries. So here we're talking about the level of development of the country and also the cost of basic necessities that it takes for a worker to reproduce their life and ability to work from day to day, as well as other notions in the culture of that society about what the standard of living should be. So, in other words, we have to differentiate between the nominal wages, or the quantitative amount on its face, versus the real wages, or the actual purchasing power of that money. Another important feature of the landscape in international capitalism is that capital is more mobile than is labor. Yes, the transfer of capital from country to country may be regulated and limited in some ways, but labor much more so. As we know, this can result in a so-called race to the bottom, in which capital says, where am I going to build my factory, here or here? Well, where do I have to pay the workers less money? So this can create competition and downward pressure on wages. So with that as a brief overview, let's get into the reading. In the 17th chapter, we were occupied with the manifold combinations which may bring about a change in magnitude of the value of labor power, this magnitude being considered either absolutely or relatively, i.e. as compared with surplus value, whilst on the other hand, the quantum of the means of subsistence in which the price of labor is realized might again undergo fluctuations independent of or different from the changes of this price. Footnote, quoting David Buchanan in his edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1814, it is not accurate to say that wages, Marx adds he deals here with their money expression, are increased because they purchase more of a cheaper article. Unquote, back to the main text. As has already been said, the simple translation of the value, or respectively of the price of labor power, into the exoteric form of wages transforms all these laws into laws of the fluctuations of wages. That which appears in these fluctuations of wages within a single country as a series of varying combinations may appear in different countries as contemporaneous difference of national wages. In the comparison of the wages in different nations, we must therefore take into account all the factors that determine changes in the amount of the value of labor power, the price and extent of the prime necessaries of life as naturally and historically developed, the cost of training the laborers, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productiveness of labor, its extensive and intensive magnitude. Even the most superficial comparison requires the reduction first of the average day wage for the same trades in different countries to a uniform working day. After this reduction to the same terms of the day wages, time wage must again be translated into piece wage, as the latter only can be a measure both of the productivity and the intensity of labor. In every country, there is a certain average intensity of labor below which the labor for the production of a commodity requires more than the socially necessary time, and therefore does not reckon as labor of normal quality. Only a degree of intensity above the national average affects, in a given country, the measure of value by the mere duration of the working time. This is not the case on the universal market, whose integral parts are the individual countries. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here it is greater, there less. These national averages form a scale whose unit of measure is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which expresses itself in more money. But the law of value in its international application is yet more modified by the fact that on the world market, the more productive national labor reckons also as the more intense, so long as the more productive nation is not compelled by competition to lower the selling price of its commodities to the level of their value. In proportion as capitalist production is developed in a country, in the same proportion do the national intensity and productivity of labor there rise above the international level. Footnote, we shall inquire in another place what circumstances in relation to productivity may modify this law for individual branches of industry. Back to the main text. The different quantities of commodities of the same kind, produced in different countries in the same working time, have therefore unequal international values, which are expressed in different prices, i.e. in sums of money varying according to international values. The relative value of money will therefore be less in the nation with the more developed mode of capitalist production than in the nation with less developed. It follows then that the nominal wages, the equivalent of labor power expressed in money, will also be higher in the first nation than in the second, which does not at all prove that this holds also for the real wages, i.e. for the means of subsistence placed at the disposal of the laborer. But even apart from these relative differences of the value of money in different countries, it will be found frequently that the daily or weekly etc. wage in the first nation is higher than in the second, while the relative price of labor, i.e. the price of labor as compared both with surplus value and with the value of the product, stands higher in the second than in the first. Footnote, James Anderson remarks in his polemic against Adam Smith, quote, "It deserves likewise to be remarked that, although the apparent price of labor is usually lower in poor countries, where the produce of the soil and grain in general is cheap, yet it is in fact for the most part really higher than in other countries. For it is not the wages that are given to the laborer per day that constitute the real price of labor, although it is its apparent price. The real price is that which a certain quantity of work performed actually costs the employer, and considered in this light, labor is in almost all cases cheaper in rich countries than in those that are poorer, although the price of grain and other provisions is usually much lower in the last than in the first. Labor estimated by the day is much lower in Scotland than in England. Labor by the piece is generally cheaper in England." That's quoting James Anderson, Observations on the Means of Exciting a Spirit of National Industry, etc., 1777. On the contrary, lowness of wages produces, in its turn, dearness of labor. Quote, "Labor being dearer or more expensive in Ireland than it is in England because the wages are so much lower." That's quoting the Royal Commission on Railways, minutes 1867. Back to the main text. J.W. Cowell, member of the Factory Commission of 1833, after careful investigation of the spinning trade, came to the conclusion that, quote, "In England wages are virtually lower to the capitalist, though higher to the operative, than on the continent of Europe." That's quoting Yore. The English factory inspector Alexander Redgrave, in his report of October 31st, 1866, proves by comparative statistics with continental states that in spite of lower wages and much longer working time, continental labor is, in proportion to the product, more expensive than English. An English manager of a cotton factory in Oldenburg declares that the working time there lasted from 5:30 a.m. to 8 p.m., Saturdays included, and that the workpeople there, when under English overlookers, did not supply during this time quite so much product as the English in 10 hours, but under German overlookers much less. Wages are much lower than in England, in many cases 50%, but the number of hands, in proportion to the machinery, was much greater, in certain departments in the proportion of 5 to 3. Mr. Redgrave gives very full details as to the Russian cotton factories. The data were given him by an English manager until recently employed there. On this Russian soil, so fruitful of all infamies, the old horrors of the early days of English factories are in full swing. The managers are, of course, English, as the native Russian capitalist is of no use in factory business. Despite all overwork, continued day and night, despite the most shameful underpayment of the workpeople, Russian manufacture manages to vegetate only by prohibition of foreign competition. I give in conclusion a comparative table of Mr. Redgrave's on the average number of spindles per factory and per spinner in the different countries of Europe. He himself remarks that he had collected these figures a few years ago, and that since that time the size of the factories and the number of spindles per laborer in England has increased. He supposes, however, an approximately equal progress in the continental countries mentioned, so that the numbers given would still have their value for purposes of comparison. And so there's a chart here, actually kind of two charts, the average number of spindles per factory and the average number of persons employed to spindles. So first, the average number of spindles per factory. You have England, France, Prussia, Belgium, Saxony, Austria, and Switzerland. The numbers respectively are 12.6 thousand, 1.5 thousand, 1.5 thousand, 4,000, 4.5 thousand, 7,000, and 8,000. And the average number of persons employed to spindles, of course, does not go in the same order. France, Russia, Prussia, Bavaria, Austria, Belgium, Saxony, Switzerland, smaller states of Germany, and Great Britain. And so there's one person to, respectively, 14, 28, 37, 46, 49, 50, 50, 55, 55, and 74 spindles. Quite a variation. Quoting Redgrave again, this comparison is yet more unfavorable to Great Britain inasmuch as there is so large a number of factories in which weaving by power is carried on in conjunction with spinning. Marx adds, while in the table the weavers are not deducted. Quote, and the factories abroad are chiefly spinning factories. If it were possible to compare like with like, strictly, I could find many cotton spinning factories in my district in which mules containing 2,200 spindles are minded by one man, the minder, and 2 assistants only, turning off daily 220 pounds of yarn, measuring 400 miles in length. That's quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1866. It is well known that in Eastern Europe as well as in Asia, English companies have undertaken the construction of railways and have, in making them, employed side by side with the native laborers a certain number of English workingmen. Compelled by practical necessity, they thus have had to take into account the national difference in the intensity of labor, but this has brought them no loss. Their experience shows that even if the height of wages corresponds more or less with the average intensity of labor, the relative price of labor varies generally in the inverse direction. In an essay on the rate of wages, one of his first economic writings, H. Carey tries to prove that the wages of the different nations are directly proportional to the degree of productiveness of the national working days, in order to draw from this international relation the conclusion that wages everywhere rise and fall in proportion to the productiveness of labor. And a footnote, the full title here is Essay on the Rate of Wages with an examination of the causes of the differences in the condition of the laboring population throughout the world, Philadelphia, 1835. The whole of our analysis of the production of surplus value shows the absurdity of this conclusion, even if Carey himself had proved his premises, instead of, after his usual uncritical and superficial fashion, shuffling to and fro a confused mass of statistical materials. The best of it is that he does not assert that things actually are as they ought to be according to his theory, for state intervention has falsified the natural economic relations. The different national wages must be reckoned, therefore, as if that part of each that goes to the state in the form of taxes came to the laborer themselves. Ought not Mr. Carey to consider further whether those, quote, state expenses are not the, quote, natural fruits of capitalistic development? The reasoning is quite worthy of the man who first declared the relations of capitalist production to be eternal laws of nature and reason, and whose free, harmonious working is only disturbed by the intervention of the state. Commenting, I can think of so many people still doing this today. Continuing, in order afterwards to discover that the diabolical influence of England on the world market, an influence which, it appears, does not spring from the natural laws of capitalist production somehow, necessitates state intervention, i.e., the protection of those laws of nature and reason by the state, alias the system of protection. He discovered further that the theorems of Ricardo and others in which existing social antagonisms and contradictions are formulated are not the ideal product of the real economic movement, but on the contrary, that the real antagonisms of capitalist production in England and elsewhere are the result of the theories of Ricardo and others. Finally, he discovered that it is, in the last resort, commerce that destroys the inborn beauties and harmonies of the capitalist mode of production. A step further, and he will perhaps discover that the one evil in capitalist production is capital itself. Only a man with such atrocious want of the critical faculty and such spurious erudition deserved, in spite of his protectionist heresy, to become the secret source of the harmonious wisdom of a Bastiat and of all the other free trade optimists of today. And that is the end of Chapter 22 and of Part 6 of 8, Wages. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can make a recurring or one-time donation, whatever you prefer. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise. So if you like this channel, where we don't run ads, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment even if it's just for the algorithm. And finally, remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure you take what you've learned here into your real-life political organizing where you live. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.